Andrew rushed towards his mother's call. He had worked up quite an appetite. His father was surprised at his speed. He should have been exhausted by now, he thought. He had been at first puzzled by Andrew's enthusiasm at helping him in the rock quarry, as he had not been asked. He'd never shown any enthusiasm before towards his father's profession. In truth, his father thought he was too small still, and lacked the temperament for the work. But suddenly, one day, there he was. What Andrew lacked in size and strength, he more than made up for in raw enthusiasm. He was a sight of almost frantic energy for an hour or two, and then he seemed to disappear towards the little grove of trees that grew just beyond. He vanished for a bit, to take a breather in the shade, his father thought, and then returned for another couple of hours of work. His father never objected or asked about these breaks. He was grateful just to have the boy around. He brightened up the whole pit. Since Andrew had been coming, laughter had been frequent. The workers seemed to take pleasure in their surroundings that had been almost absent before. Andrew was like a cool breeze on a hot day to the men, always anxious to help, seemingly always available. The nearest in age to Andrew in the pit was at least 5 years his senior. Andrew beat his father to the little stout stone house at the edge of the little village where the quarrymen lived, but he did not eat until his father had been served and seated, had said grace, thanking first the Lord and then the king for their meager prosperity. He was patient. He hardly ever muttered a word of complaint, and always quietly watched with his bright eyes the activity around him. He carefully measured out his portions so that his father would finish first, and he knew his mother would give him another portion for helping at the quarry. But he also knew his father needed the nourishment more. His work, after all, was an option for the family, whereas his father's was their sustenance. The only thing that darkened his eyes, although just a flash here and there, was the fact that he had not seen her today. But the bright returned in his eyes as he realized that surely she would be there tomorrow, and if not, surely the day after that. He would dance with her soon, and feel the cool warmth of her hands in his, hear her laughter singing, and watch the dimples on her cheeks as her dark hair danced around her shoulders. Before the year was out, his secret would be revealed. One day the wagon had been filled, and there were plenty of extra stones laid out, waiting for the next load. The quarrymen took a break. Some of them went to the little village and returned with bread, dried fish, goat skins of extra water diluted with wine to share. But Andrew's father headed towards the little grove of trees where he often heard the singing laughter to find out what it was that had so enchanted his son. He saw them, hand in hand, laughing and running, half dancing together. It was quite a sight, and his father took a deep breath and watched the beauty of it. It had been a rainy spring, and miserable one at that. It seemed that mud had been their world, caked heavily on the sandals as they returned home from the quarry every day. The humidity prevented them from ever drying completely, and each morning he put them on again, still dirty and damp, despite being near the cooking pit. But the rainy spring had given them all a bountiful summer of wildflowers. They had been multicolored at first, with bright reds and yellows tinted with blue here and there. But these flowers had been short-lived. They had all been replaced now by vast fields of violet and green. It was against this backdrop that he watched his son, with his heart nearly bursting from the joy he could feel flowing from his son's face. They hardly shared a word between them, just laughter, and their activity did not follow any discernible plan or pattern, just chasing, turning to wrestling, turning back to the chase again, turning to hand-holding, and shared observance of a particular flower that caught one of them, causing them to kneel and pluck it, spin it in delicate fingers, then throw it at the other, which resulted in another chase. She could climb better than he, and more than once he watched Andrew clumsily fall from the tree where he could not reach her, only to hear her laughter singing out again. But then there was silence. Something caught them both, and they both stood stock still, heads cocked, shoulders turned away from him. They embraced, and his father almost shed a tear at the tenderness they shared. Her hand went to his cheek, gently touching it with delicate fingers, as if she was trying to touch still water without disturbing her reflection, while his fingers threaded through her long hair, his eyes watching his fingers as they slowly slid through, wide with amazement. They pressed each other's head to their shoulder for a moment, and then she was gone, dashing over the hill to an unheard call. He saw melancholy in his son's posture for the first time ever, he thought, but it lasted just a moment, just a flash. His shoulders righted, back straightened, and his strength returned as he turned and started to jog back to the quarry. But then he saw his father, and went rigid. He started to turn for an instant, as if thinking to run away, but he stopped. A smile started to grow on his face, and he blushed, as he knew his secret was out. He walked almost timidly towards his father, but they shared no words. His father embraced him tightly, and they walked back to the quarry for a lunch of fish and bread. His father did not discuss this with his mother, for there was no need. He knew once he saw her that evening, with the way she looked at Andrew, that she'd known now for some time. There was a quiet contentment the little family shared now. They talked less, but Andrew's joy had given them happiness as deep as a well. Andrew grew strong at the quarry. His frequent breaks did not disturb his co-workers, as he outpaced them all when he was there. Still, the king did not demand more of them, so their breaks became more frequent as Andrew grew to maturity. No matter how much rock they quarried and shaped, he could only build extensions to the palace and city walls so fast. 5 wagon loads a day was all his builders and engineers could use. The city was growing wealthy. The dancing little girl with the singing laughter grew to a beauty. Her name was Maricel, and her family were shepherds in the valley just beyond the quarry. There were vast fields of rich foliage for the sheep and goats, especially during the rainy years. There were dry times too, but she learned to time the herds so they would feed in one area of the valley during the mornings, and then lead them across for afternoons and evenings closer to the quarry. Her whistling signals were not only for the sheep and goats, but called Andrew, regardless of how much activity was at the quarry. At least once a week they would rendezvous, and still they hardly ever spoke. One day an engineer came with a wagon and spoke with the quarryman while the wagon was being loaded. They were discussing specific veins of the rock, and Andrew saw the engineer drawing diagrams in the dirt with the quarry master crouching before him. Andrew knew something special was in the works, but he was distracted from listening too closely by the engineer's escort. They were armored, on brilliant, tall, lithe horses that looked like they could race the wind to shame. They sat bolt upright, and without moving their heads hardly at all, silently took note of everything around them. Their tunics were white linen, lined with emerald green, the king's colors. Their helmets and shields were polished brightly, so that when the horse turned or their heads lowered, Andrew had to hold his hand in front of his face, as if another sun shone directly from them. Andrew then noticed with a bit of a start that he'd moved too close to them. Nobody else was watching them, only he. He backed away from them, and turned to walk back to the others, but noticed the escort watching his every move. Andrew understood somehow and became nervous. They were watching him. Andrew became more nervous when the engineer mounted his horse and turned to go. One of the guardsmen shared words with him, and he pulled back on his mount and turned suddenly. The engineer pointed directly at Andrew and spoke back to the guard. A cold shiver went through Andrew as he watched the guard's helmet nod. The engineer smiled at Andrew and turned his horse back around, and in a gallop the party was gone. The wagon followed slowly, the aged wheels creaking under the load. The quarrymaster was speaking to them, but Andrew's mind was elsewhere. He watched the dust of the horses settle over the hill and thought about the stories he'd heard about the city. It was the only time he'd not heard the whistle. His father had to nudge him out of his dreams before he heard it. He excused himself, and to the understanding chuckle of the quarrymaster, dashed off to tell Maricel about the guardsmen. The next week the quarrymen were startled to see a line of horses approaching, without a wagon. A man in fine robes was at the head of the column. He was a nobleman from the city, and he asked for Andrew's father by name. Andrew's father was startled, as he had never seen the man before, and worried looks flashed around the quarry as he laid down his chisel and mallet, and approached the noble, bowing low. They shared some words, and Andrew felt tremendous relief as he watched his father's face brighten. Andrew saw them both looking at him, and in the pride and joy in his father's face, he knew what it was that lay in his future. He had been recruited into the noble's guard. His family would receive a generous stipend and have the opportunity to live in the city if Andrew proved his worth. The noble was comforting his father as he reassured him that if he is not fit for the guard, he could always return to the quarry. Andrew too would benefit, as he would be housed in the noble's palace in the city, earning his own pay. The noble did not speak to Andrew, but turned and trotted off with his guard in tow. His father shared the news with him. In 1 week's time, Andrew would report to the noble's palace for the beginning of his training. He would be there 6 months before he would have time off. He would have 1 more year of training after that, before he would be given his mantle and enlisted as a full guardsman. He could voluntarily quit at any time during this initial period, but once the 18 months was over, he would have to take an oath then to serve his noble for 20 years. But he would have time off from time to time, for frequent visits. It was, after all, not even a half-day's ride away on horse. All Andrew thought about was the fact that once he was a full guardsman, he could have enough money to marry and house his beautiful Maricel in the city, dressing her in gowns, surrounding her with tapestries, and watch their children play in the cobbled streets. He left her with tears on her cheek, but she was nodding reassuringly as she wiped her tears, gesturing him on, for she saw the dream as he did. She knew this opportunity came along very rarely for people of their class. Their children and grandchildren would have a radically different life than theirs had been. The door suddenly opened a possibility to both of their families. The future lay on Andrew's rugged shoulders, teetering like a fulcrum. But Andrew was focused. He knew what he had to do. Every sparring and wrestling match was an obstacle to be overcome. When he was exhausted, or more accurately, when he'd exhausted his instructors, he would be given a class or writing lesson. Every class and lecture was met with focused intensity. Every mock battle, every task, an opponent kept him from bringing his beautiful Maricel to be by his side. He unleashed a deliberate, calculated fury with all his rock-quarrying strength into every duel. Full guardsmen 10 years his senior and more fell, time and again, yielding with helpless, disbelieving laughter to the strength and fury that lay hidden beneath that quiet, gentle exterior. The noble himself watched many of these duels and jousts with pleasure, but word got out about his find. Andrew would never complete his training with the noble, and take an oath to serve him. One day, just after breakfast, Andrew was summoned into the courtyard. The noble spoke to him directly, for the first time, actually. Andrew had bowed low, as he'd seen his father do, and listened carefully. He was advised to be careful not to hurt his next opponent. He would be dueling, with wooden sword and shield, the captain of the king's guard. The captain had heard about Andrew's intelligence and skill, and was incredulous that someone so young could just appear out of the rock quarry and out-combat veterans 10 years his senior. He'd come to see for himself. Andrew grew instantly nervous as he beheld the captain. He was strong, like him, tall and broad. Andrew had never liked being watched by the glaring helmets of the king's guard, but Andrew realized at once that the captain, still and stolid as a stone wall from the waist up, had a nervous step in his stance, just one step, and then another. He just could not stand still. Andrew ignored the white linen mantle with the gold-trimmed green embroidery and the brilliantly shining helmet. Andrew instead grew angry, but he tamed the beast growing within him, to unleash him slowly, stroke by stroke, not all at once. He would watch for the moment, and then unleash it all. Here, he thought, was the door, behind which was the dancing laughter, and the cool, delicate fingers of Maricel on his cheek. To get to her, he had to smash that impassive door before him, knock it to the ground. It would not be easy. The two danced, slowly spinning, like two leaves in an enormous eddy, watching the movements of the other, in a lazy circle, one around the other. When Andrew would step close, he immediately stepped back again, as he saw the twitch of the shoulder and elbow of the captain. readying for a strike. Andrew noted this the second time it happened. He knew what to expect. Andrew slowly grew in strength and stature, while the captain seemed to shrink. For here was the captain, battle-hardened, older, wiser, with all the gleaming armor of recognition, too overly cautious to approach the leather-bound apprentice before him. Andrew lunged, but not with his sword, but with his shield hand, grabbing the wrist of the captain and preventing his strike. He caught the captain off balance and knocked him down with the momentum of his movement leveled in his clenched fist and shoulder. He was on top of the captain, beating his lowered helmet with his fist, trapping his shield with his hip, rendering that arm useless, holding the other wrist with his shield hand above his head useless. The captain raged in fury and kicked Andrew off, threw himself on top of him, holding him down with his shield, and slowly overpowering his hand, bringing his wooden sword down towards Andrew's neck. But Andrew continued his roll, and they both separated and sprung to their feet. Andrew stabbed his sword in swift and hard, but it was only a feint, and as the captain warded it off with his shield, he left his front exposed for an instant. Andrew then focused all his weight into the edge of his wooden shield, gripping the leather strap with all his strength, and pounded it directly into the captain's face. He took a step back, then another, dazed. Andrew clenched his fist around his sword, and gripping with white knuckles with his shield hand onto the white mantle with the gold-trimmed green embroidery, drove his fist into the stunned open jaw of the captain. He fell like a rag doll to the ground. Andrew then remembered the cautious words of his lord, and his face fell in shame. Attendants and guardsmen ran shouting into the courtyard. Andrew readied himself to be arrested and thrown into a dungeon. He remembered the tear-streaked face of Marcel waving goodbye to him from the top of that green hill, and a tear started down his cheek. Some of the guardsmen rushed to the captain, shaking him and dashing water on his face. Others were surrounding Andrew, and Andrew dropped his shield and sword, ready for the arrest, his strength leaving him. They were grabbing him and holding him, but he did not struggle. Then he realized they were raising him onto their shoulders. He looked about him and saw his noble, the lord, clapping, smiling at him. He saw the captain rousing and rising. He then realized who it was that was lifting him. White mantles with green embroidery. The king's own guard had come to watch and were celebrating him, cheering him. He was being carried from the courtyard out of the noble's palace grounds and straight into the city streets. He was being taken to the great white palace. When he got there, he went straight to the entrance tower and through a side door. His leather gear was being stripped from him, and excited voices surrounding him, each one trying to communicate something to him. Then he realized he was being given a white mantle with green embroidery in a kind of impromptu ceremony. But that was not the amazement that dropped his jaw. Andrew found himself kneeling before the man who handed it to him, the dusty, dented helmet of the captain of the guard. The captain was congratulating him, and sternly telling him that it was his duty to serve the king, and also advising him that even though he'd proven beyond a shadow of a doubt his fighting ability, he would still be under the captain's command. Andrew readily accepted and tried not to look into the captain's face, for he did not want the captain to see him smiling, with tears streaming down his face. His training period was over, completely. It had been just over 5 months since he left the quarry and his beloved Marcel. He could see her now, dancing with him, hand in hand, and almost hear the singing laughter as her dark eyes closed into crescents, her dimples laughed, and her hair swing away from her shoulders. She was almost here. He stayed in the palace for a couple of weeks after that, learning the duties and the layout. He was being given a crash course. He readily memorized everything faithfully. It took 2 weeks for his custom-sized armor and helmet to be fashioned. Then he was taken with 2 others to the throne room in the presence of the king himself, with his ministers and nobles gathered around him to take his vows. He knelt and swore service, allegiance, and fealty to the king. He dedicated the next 20 years of his life to this duty. After this was a feast, of course, for the guardsmen, though not in the presence of the king or the nobility. Andrew could not stop his excited chatter to the captain and the other officers about the details of how to marry, how he and his wife would be quartered, where their children could play. All these arrangements would take time, of course. and there were rare requests for someone so junior and young as Andrew. Still, the captain knew he had a valuable asset in the young stonemason. In peacetime as well, he would be very useful to the engineers, as he clearly knew stone. They could put him to work supervising the construction. The captain also promised the young man he would indeed mention to the engineers the possibility that his father could be brought to the city as well, as another potential foreman for future projects. Finally, at the end of the feast, the captain took Andrew aside and explained to him that it had been 6 months since he left his family at home. Well, almost. He'd earned his leave, and he could take a week to go back and visit his family. Andrew did not sleep that night, so anxious was he for the morning. He did not think about the surprise his family and fellow quarrymen would have when he showed up with one of the king's elite horses, wearing shining armor and the white mantle with the green embroidery. All he thought about was Monticello. Andrew was dressed in his armor, and the white mantle with the green embroidery was draped over him. He was assisted onto one of the king's elite horses and handed a shining helmet he carefully lowered onto his head, adjusting it just so. Finally, the captain came into the room, wished him well, and handed him a little leather purse. Andrew was impressed by the weight. The captain explained the amounts. So much was compensation for his father for the loss of his son as an assistant. The rest was money he had earned so far in service of the king. The captain also explained that part of his earnings were in advance for the future, as there was a chance it might be a while before he'd be given leave again. Andrew paused at this caution. He wanted to know more, but he could also tell by the captain's tone that he was free to go. He knew every second more he stayed was 1 second less he would spend with Monticello. So he spurred the horse, spun him around, raised him up, and leaned forward, and off they went. Andrew loved the sound the horse made on the cobbled streets. He shouted at the citizens as he rode, clearing them before him. Some cheered him as he rode by. A few cursed at his unnecessary recklessness. He felt a sense of pride as the guardsman at the South City gate waved to him. He looked back as he rode through and realized that the walled city, with the green flags and pennants flying high from the towers, was his home. That, he thought, was his home now. Quite an improvement from the little stone hovel he had known. But then he realized that despite the pride he felt when he thought about the city, he knew it would not be home, not yet. He knew that deep down he just could not be at rest until Monticello was by his side. Wherever she lay her head, he understood that was his home. He was indeed riding home. He realized after a while that he'd been galloping the horse non-stop, and that he was on the verge of exhausting him. He recognized the hills that lay just beyond, and knew he would be near his grazing lands in another hour or two. He therefore dismounted, and allowed his horse to take a break, graze a bit, and drink from the little brook he was about to cross. He took his helmet off and walked about, stretching his legs. He noticed some flowers, and he knelt down and picked them, braiding them together, picking some more, braiding those in, and endeavoring to form a loop he would drape around his armored arm, so that he would have a gift to give Monticello. He found some others, and smiled, thinking about the flowers as a kind of crown or tiara atop of her beautiful hair. He'd almost finished his braided crown when he heard a commotion. At first he thought it was conversation from the wagon of rock that came down this road towards the city, but he'd passed one already, not even an hour earlier, and they never ran close together. It certainly sounded at first like the wagon, but this was several wagons. The oxen that pulled them were different from the ones he knew, exhausted and near spent. The people that crowded alongside the wagons looked different too, desperate, haggard, lost, dirty. He tried to talk to these people, carefully watching them for odd movements, but they clearly showed no threat. There were about 30 of them, and they spoke strangely. He could understand most of their words, but not their purpose. They were journeying to the city. They needed help. They needed to talk to the king. He gave them directions, but no money. They would be there a little after nightfall at their pace. They watered the oxen for a bit as they chatted, but they whipped them on a bit sooner than necessary, Andrew thought. He gave no more thought to them as he finished his gift. When he rounded the next hill, he turned from the road and aimed directly into the hills. He knew this area now. Part of her family's grazing lands were just over the next hill, or perhaps the one after that. He did not see the next group of refugees, nor was he able to connect the presence of the refugees with the caution given him by his captain. He only saw her face, just over the next hill, and then the next. He exhausted the horse. He did not see her at first, but he found her father. He knew Andrew, of course, but he did not know any of the king's guard. He was frightened and shouted in alarm for help when he saw Andrew's rapid approach. The sheep scattered, and Andrew felt sorrow at his greedy haste. Andrew calmed his horse and called to the man by name, and the man stopped and turned and stared in disbelief, for he recognized at once that voice. Andrew dismounted, and then remembered his helmet, took it off, and began to cry. Everything he'd done had been for her. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to ask the bewildered shepherd for permission to marry his daughter, but he could just not get the words out properly. He suddenly realized that all his dreams were coming true, and soon he would see her. Soon she would be with him, and then he heard her, calling and shouting. She was on the other side of the valley, but she could see her father, and she knew he was with a soldier, but not close enough to understand yet. Sound carries very well in valleys, and when she saw her father embracing the guardsman, and heard him sobbing, heard his voice, she knew, and screamed with all the intensity she had. She ran, and the wind rushed down from the distant mountains, urging her onward, assisting her, pushing her closer. He heard her, and without yet really communicating anything meaningful to her poor father, stumbled, blinded by his tears, to the sound of her shouting. As before, when they met, they shared no words. They both just hugged and kissed each other on the cheeks many times, and then, as if on cue, were completely quiet and still, caressing the face of the other with slow touches and wide red swollen eyes. He then remembered, and took the little wreath of flowers from his arm and propped it gently on her head. She laughed, squealing, her eyes squinting into little crescents. She knew, and he knew. He did not need to ask. They both knew, and without speaking looked at her father together. It was clear that he knew too. He just stood there smiling. He did not know what to do with his hands, and they fumbled together in front of him. They had not had any ceremony or followed any of the many cultural customs of their time and place, but everyone would celebrate them and knew that they were husband and wife already. They were seemingly one flesh in two bodies. They were only healthy and whole as God intended them to be, when in the presence of the other. Any separation painfully clutched at their hearts, and yet their love grew stronger still as the week progressed. So many plans were made. Andrew could not house her yet, but soon, maybe within a year, the captain had said, he could send for her. His father would come next, followed by his mother, after his father had proven his worth to the engineers and given appropriate housing. When they started having children, certainly after the second surviving child had started to walk, she could send for her mother, or sister if she wished, to help care for the children. She had so many plans, and listened intently to Andrew's excited descriptions about the housing provided to the married guardsmen. They would be living in the city, on the White Palace grounds, just inside the main gate. She was excited about the idea that they could have little boxes, little urns and barrels that they could grow flowers in, propped up on window ledges and around the doors of the house. Many people did that, although most grew some sort of vegetable, peppers, onions, or garlic. She loved the descriptions of the courtyards with fig and olive trees that lay hidden behind the palace walls of the nobles, and the great courtyard within the king's white palace, ringed by olive and fig trees heavy with fruit. And the great market squares in the city proper, also ringed by olive and fig trees, where people could pick to their heart's content, free for all, the king's bounty for his people. Also, she loved hearing about the water from the many wells, as fresh as the streams they knew. Andrew spent 3 full days with her and her family before he remembered he'd not seen his father. He shared some of his income with Marticel's father, as a promise in monetary form of his good intentions. He needn't have done it, for the man loved him like a son for perhaps 10 years already. The wedding would only be a formality of what he knew was already there. Andrew was as much a part of his family as Marcel. When Andrew decided to make the short ride to his father, Marcel was prepared to say goodbye to him again. She readied herself and brought all her strength forward, but Andrew only shook his helmet at her once she was astride his steed. He reached down, and evoking a laughing scream from Marcel, lifted her easily onto the horse, sitting side-saddle beside him. She called out to her father, clearly embarrassed, but hugging Andrew's armor, knelt her head happily onto his rocking shoulder, closed her eyes, and gave thanks that she'd been given such an opportunity to have this life, to experience such concentrated pleasure. For surely most persons in their entire lives, even if they live to see grandchildren, will never experience a fraction of this joy. Unlike Marcel's father, Andrew's father knew his son. He did not remember noticing the armor and the white mantle with the green embroidery. He only saw Andrew, and he too did not need explanations. He saw Marcel's face poking out from behind, saw the love flowing from her face, and remembering the bright laughing little girl from that summer years ago, recalled the thick flowing love they'd shared. He grew teary to see such joy. The purse of gold coins and Andrew's explanations and expectations, plans, they just seemed like pointless distractions. He really just wanted to watch them together, for seeing that much love and joy in another gave him joy. All the years of hefting rock, carrying and hammering seemed worthwhile somehow when they were together. The songs of birds somehow made sense to him now. When he saw a beautiful sunset or a field of flowers, he understood why now. Even the gentle frailty of a butterfly's wings evoked a nod. He knew why beauty existed, because these two had found each other, and God had to make a context for love so dense and focused. Pain and labor too, easy and worthwhile. He no longer questioned things. Each needed the other. The moon made sense because of the sun, and night gave birth to the day. He could see the tidal flow of the waves on the beach every time his hand flowed through her hair, and the careful kiss of a leaf to the ground every time her long, delicate fingers touched his cheek, or his lips, or his nose. There really was nothing else, he thought. But then he wondered if Andrew really understood that. He felt that she did. He saw it in her touch. But he wondered about his son. Andrew explained about what would happen, when, depending on this and that, he really felt sure that he could bring these things to pass, and seemed impatient when his parents did not share in his excitement. They both just seemed distracted. Andrew thought it was due to their disbelief. After all, they were older than he, and they had never been through the city as he had. They did not know people inside the palace and on the guard towers. They were right to be cautious, for he was young, he realized that, and young people get hung up on dreams. New things, too, come more easily to young people than to the older generation, for they've gotten used to things being this and such. Why strive for more? But he could see it. He would make it happen. The struggle to make it so was behind him. All that remained was the wait. They stayed overnight and the next day. That evening, however, Andrew and Marcel started back to her family. They stopped at the quarry so Andrew could chat for a bit with his old mates at the end of their day. He shouted back at his father reminders about their plans and what he should do and when. But he wasn't listening. He just enjoyed them together. He noticed as they rode off that she was lazily drawing circular lines on his back and shoulder with a gentle finger, feeling his mochi, watching her finger dreamily. Andrew wasn't noticing her so carefully, but his mind was instead on the future. He wondered how he could have raised such a foolish boy. Was it his fault? Didn't he know that the future's only a dream? He worried about his son a little. He never worried about Marcel. Andrew would have to start back to the city in the morning. He slept that night with her family, and in the morning Andrew patiently explained each part of the armor as she dressed him, yet again. This time, however, she added little comments herself, speaking directly to each part of his armor, saying things like, "And you, Gauntlet, don't forget to protect my Andrew's wrist. And you, Breastplate, don't allow any swords or arrows to scar my Andrew." Andrew smiled at these little whispers, and she smiled back at him, proud of all he'd become, proud that others had seen in him what she'd seen many years ago, the strength, fidelity, and beauty of that person inside the body. Finally, Maricel's father walked up to Andrew and handed him a little pouch. Andrew looked inside and saw black sand and pebbles, and was confused at first. Maricel's father explained that he'd overheard him chatting about window boxes and barrels in which people grew flowers back in the city. He thought Andrew could plant these in good dark soil in one of the boxes and keep it by the window where he was billeted. He promised Andrew that when spring came he would be pleased at what he would find from the seeds. The man smiled at Andrew, his son, and Andrew smiled back, promising to be back soon, perhaps as early as a few months. He called him Dad now, as Maricel did. The old man liked that. Andrew mounted his steed, and the horse grew anxious, ready for another run. He steadied his mount, and reassured Maricel that a year would pass like nothing, and they would be inseparable for the rest of their lives. Maricel had been working all morning to build up the strength for this moment. She now summoned all of it to try to get out 2 good, strong sentences in a full voice to comfort and strengthen her soon-to-be husband. She shouted to him, "I love you," as his horse began to descend the hill. "There goes my husband." And then her strength started to fade, and tears started to flow from her eyes. She could not speak, but she kept her posture and her head erect, waving excitedly, for he was getting far, and could only see her partially from his eye slits in his helmet, especially at this angle. He kept waving, though, so she waved. Then he turned, and the path that led to the road went behind some trees. She could hear the horse picking up speed. He would emerge briefly as the path rounded the hill, and then she would wait for that. But in the meantime her father had to support her, for she'd started to sob. Her shoulders shaking, her knees grew weak. Andrew, too, had turned away because he simply could not see any more. His eyes were blurry. He had to take his helmet off and wipe his eyes. He did not want Maricel to see him do that. He wanted to be strong for her. He wondered why he was crying. He would be back, after all, in just another few months. But then he started to remember his captain's caution, and he started to think about the refugees. He remembered the words his beloved had said to his armor, and thought about real battle, the possibility of war for the first time. Well, he thought, if war does come, surely we will be married, with at least one child. She won't be alone and safe for the rest of her life behind the city walls. He started to give some thought about where to find nice dark earth in which to plant his seeds. He would start to look for it when he got close to the city. He could send a boy, giving him a coin to dig it up for him. Surely he could have some carpenter make a box for him that would fit his window. It did have a large ledge. He wondered if the seeds were little violet flowers. His thoughts remained on this topic for some time, until he began to approach the road. He heard commotion, and knew what to expect. More refugees. Yes, there were several old wagons, and more spent, exhausted oxen. He started to trot towards the road when he heard excited shouts. He heard galloping, an oncoming column of cavalry. He galloped headlong towards it, and discovered armed guardsmen like himself, but with a type of golden red embroidery he had not seen. One of them spotted him and halted the column, shouting, "One of the king's men is here." An officer trotted towards him, took off his helmet, and introduced himself. It was members of the guard of one of the nobility, whose palace lay far outside the city, in the direction opposite from Andrew and Maricel's home. The officer was speaking rapidly, and Andrew had difficulty following, despite his half-year crash course in military matters. Apparently the king had enlisted guardsmen from each of his nobles to form a kind of distant scouting expedition in strength, to visit a troubled sector of the kingdom into which refugees were streaming. The guardsmen had enlisted peasants from the countryside into a kind of a home guard and built fortifications in the area, while individual guardsmen snuck out of the kingdom to explore the validity of the refugees' stories. Apparently the neighboring kingdom was being invaded and had just fallen. The invaders, though, were not trying to take over the land, but just a massive mob of murdering heathen who would pour into one kingdom, ransack it for all the wealth they could gather, and then head into another, until they could not load more gold and riches onto another cart. There were reports of thousands of them. 2 days ago they swarmed onto the king's land, slaughtering all the home guard and 81 out of the 100 guardsmen. These 19 were all that remained. They thought the massive army of cruel savages may be one day behind them, hopefully more. Their horses needed rest, however, and they would have to stop. The horses were sprinters, not marathon runners. Andrew, however, had a fresh horse. He had to ride, and ride hard, to deliver the message to the king. Andrew was trapped. He'd sworn personal allegiance to the king in his presence. He could not ignore this task. Yet he wanted to get word to Maricel. How would he send word to his father? How could he explain to these exhausted guardsmen without delaying his mission at least an hour, that one of them had to go the opposite way for at least 2 hours, following complex and vague directions to find a nomadic shepherd family and bring the young woman who was not yet his wife to the city? He realized in an instant that it would be impossible, but that Maricel, who was difficult to find, would be more difficult to find if she were hiding, which she could do quite well. He knew she was a survivor and a good tree climber, and that he could not hope to rescue her now. He had to serve the king first, then to ask leave to fetch his wife-to-be. He galloped immediately towards the city. He would kill the horse if he had to, but he would not stop or slow down. He passed the stream where he'd stopped a week before in short time. He started to think that the horse understood the urgency of the mission. But then, when he rounded a bend in the road, he heard screams and saw a refugee woman running towards him, screaming unintelligible words, and then realized she had an arrow in her back. He drew his sword, raised his shield, and prepared to ride through the chaos ahead, but 2 arrows sliced into the neck of his horse, and a large rock slammed into his shield, almost knocking him off. He rode on, but the horse was losing speed, and he heard men shouting, running, and at least 2 horses were charging through the woods behind him, following. He realized he could not outrun them the way his horse was bleeding, so he turned just in time to meet the first rider emerging from the woods. He had a lance, but Andrew easily parried it with his shield and brought his sword up just under the edge of the oncoming helmet. As the rider charged forward, the sword plunged into his neck, and then, as the rider rode past, Andrew simply brought his wrist forward, partially severing the head, and spurred his horse forward to meet the second oncoming charger. This man had no helmet, though, and only leather armor covered his assorted furs and hide. He was heavily bearded, screaming like an animal. His eyes were inhumanely wide as he stared at Andrew, but he did not engage Andrew, but rode on past through the wood. Andrew charged into the men on foot who were running towards him. One man had an axe, another a large rock he hurled at Andrew, but missed him completely. Andrew went towards the now unarmed rock thrower, and despite 2 quick dodges, plunged his sword into the man's collarbone, removed it, and brought it into his right just in time to parry the axe. He dismounted and charged the axe wielder, approached him before he could raise it again for the full swing, knocked him down with the full weight of his charge, and plunged his sword into his belly, pushing it up under his ribs, then sliced it back and forth. He walked over and started to comfort his horse, who was bleeding profusely. He killed 3 and allowed a 4th to escape, but he needed a horse. He then remembered the headless rider and started to jog after the horse, who'd entered the woods on the far side of the road. The rider had fallen, and the horse had begun foraging when Andrew found her. He quickly mounted her, and decided he would go back for the battle axe. He thought that weapon would come in handy. As he retrieved the axe, he thought he heard an arrow whistle past. He quickly remounted his fat little mare and rode off. She was a bulky horse, a bit more like a farmer's plow horse than an elegant steed, but it was faster than on foot, and Andrew spurred her on. Andrew soon found out why the barbarians liked these stout, strong horses. They were not fast, but they could run all day, and then some. Despite his luck in finding the mare and riding her quickly to the king with his urgent message, the facts about the horse were not welcome news to the king's men. Of the guardsmen who had given Andrew his message and mission, 6 made it to the city the following morning. When Andrew returned to the city, heralds immediately were dispatched with 2 guardsmen to escort each to all the surrounding towns for all the people to arm themselves and prepare for war, and head to the city or to the noble's palace, whichever was their fealty. Some towns went to certain areas for this eventuality, for it had happened almost once a generation, whereas other towns went to the city. Each town and village, however, had a certain levy of men they had to give to the king for defense of the city. The kingdom, their language, their culture, their history would live after all, if one or two of the nobles' estates were lost. But if the city were in ruin and the population scattered, all would be lost, and no one would be left to tell their stories or remember their names. Their city, labors, dreams, and stories would lie as dead as the ruins, for future people to move in and occupy. The city and its king were the heart and the body of the kingdom. Semi-skilled, partially armed soldiers and pitifully armored peasants streamed into the city, along with occasional wagon loads of escaping refugees, although these came ominously infrequently now. None of the heralds or their escorts returned from the west where Andrew had ridden. Whatever door Andrew had ridden through, for now anyway, was firmly shut to the king and all his men. Then, the second night after Andrew's return into the city, fires of camps could be seen in the hills just on the horizon, a thin yellow bright in the direction of Andrew's home. Andrew was amazed at the number of little yellow glows. The next day they could hear the approaching horde. The first thing Andrew did when he woke that morning was plant his little seeds. He'd found some dark earth in the great courtyard of the White Palace and dug it up. He then put the earth in a discarded wooden box he'd found with rotted sides, but a stout bottom. He propped it in his window, for it overlooked the great courtyard, not the oncoming battle, and watered it, as per directions from Maricel's father. He felt sure with the speed of the oncoming enemy that they did not have time to thoroughly search or comb through the hills as they passed. They knew where the city lay, and wealth is what they were after, not flocks of goats and sheep. He had a sinking feeling that his parents were dead, but he seriously doubted that Maricel's family could be found, even by him, if they did not want to be found. He had a feeling he would be on duty for several days possibly, and was excited by the idea that the seeds may have sprouted by the time he came back for a well-deserved rest. After the enemy was defeated and fled, he could send a messenger to Maricel, telling her about the sprouts. It would be a good icebreaker, something to focus on without having to deal with the pain they would no doubt endure. If the enemy were not defeated, well, it wouldn't matter then. He reported for duty with an eager smile on the western wall, near the great tower on the southwest corner of the city walls. He felt ready. He saw a column of men walking from the south, unusually slowly, he thought, considering the situation in the city. Some were no doubt professional guardsmen, but most of them wore poorly fitted mail and helmets from some past generation. They walked slowly, perhaps, because they were exhausted, and then Andrew heard a cheer from the two towers over the south gate. Then a guardsman came jogging over from the first tower above the south gate behind him and started sharing the news. Helmets poked out from the inside the windows of the great southwest tower to listen in. Refugees had poured into two other neighboring kingdoms because of this mass mob. These kingdoms understood our situation and promised to send all available aid at once, so we can catch this army on two sides in the open, with little or no organized defense. We need to hold out for maybe a week, 10 days at the most, and they will be here with hundreds of mounted soldiers to harass them and keep them here. And maybe a week after that, thousands of soldiers on foot. We were to be the bait for the mousetrap. 20 days became our motto, then 19. Not 3 hours after the last column of soldiers wearily filed into the city, the mob poured from the woods, charging in chaotic swarms not unlike flying bees, Andrew thought, towards the city. The archers at first held their fire, waiting for a more organized group. They soon found targets. There were about 40 stout barbarians carrying a huge log between them, with another 40 or so running beside them, holding wide sheets of metal over their heads, like shared umbrellas, to try to batter the door to the western entrance. Andrew admired their skill at having analyzed the city so well, for that door was by far thinner than the others. Smaller, true. Only one small cart or 2 men could walk through side by side. But with an army like that, all you need is a small hole for them to pour through. Andrew also understood that for the attacker, the earlier the better. Some officer from one of the towers that stand on either side above the western gate shouted something indistinct, and a black rain of arrows at once rained down on the ram. Two of the umbrella carriers fell, but the ram approached at the same speed. Another volley like black smoke wafting downwards, and three more shield bearers lay dead, with arrows visibly sticking out from various shoulders, helmets, and shields. The whole thing looked like a fuzzy worm now, and the first blow hit the door. There was a tremendous thud that reverberated throughout the whole city. The mob outside seemed to stop, and a moment of quiet eerily stretched, and then, as if one voice, the ramming crew grunted a shout, and a second thud shook the wall. Arrows now rained down on them at a steady rate, and several more of the carriers were dead. The mob abandoned all other parts of the city and started converging on this one little door. They all stayed just outside of arrow range and waited, watching. Half the shields were fallen now, but it was clear that the mission had been carefully thought out. Whoever had organized it had thought the thing through. It only took 18 of these hulking men to swing that ram, but once they dipped below that number, they all dropped the ram and fled. But it took some time for the archers to reduce them to that number. Andrew thought they'd achieved 12 blows, although another guardsman beside him had said it was 14. Andrew never saw the door, but he saw the faces of the men who'd seen it, and heard the frantic activity of the carpenters that worked on it once the enemy withdrew from this first sortie. The captain approached Andrew as evening approached and gave him a wineskin and some bread, and pointed to the edge of the woods just at the top of the hill. "Do you see that fellow on horseback?" Andrew nodded. "Watch him. He's been watching this all day, and several riders have ridden up to him, then ridden off, as if transmitting his orders. I think he's in charge. You have a good vantage point here. See what you think." Andrew nodded. That gentleman, clearly apart from the rabble he commanded, watched from the same spot for almost 2 weeks, disappearing only after the last light faded into total night, and even then only just for a few hours. The next day the mob assembled quietly, almost patiently, just outside of arrow range, on opposite sides of the city, half on the eastern side, half on the west. 4 teams of rams then appeared, 2 just out of range from either side. It was clear they planned to send in one team until they could no longer be effective, and then send in the other immediately behind. Andrew's interest focused on the western door, as it was far smaller and weaker than the eastern door, which was a duplicate of the main city gate to the south. Same thickness, only a little narrower. It would be far easier, Andrew thought, to batter down the main gate than that one. Andrew thought that the eastern door was a diversion to try to drain the archers away from the west. He knew 3 out of 4 archers on the western gates, and he had not seen any repositioning. He knew it was hopeless, and just did not understand how these barbarians thought that they could break through, especially after several hours of repair and reinforcement. He felt sure that some kind of iron bars had been added to the stout doors, perhaps even earthworks behind those. He thought he would watch with amusement. Then the first ram team charged, with the helpless umbrella men running alongside, holding the metal sheets. Andrew heard the shouts and the clanging of the arrows like handfuls of pebbles thrown onto a metal roof. Several dropped already. There was another volley. A few more dropped. Then he heard it. Thud. It sounded different. They'd made the gate stronger. Unlike yesterday, they got 7 good hits before there was any detectable difference in the tone of the thud. The first team lasted only 9 hits. The survivors ran off, many with arrows sticking straight out of them that wiggled as they ran. The second team rapidly replaced them, only suffering 1 volley of arrows before delivering their first thud. Then a shiver went through Andrew's spine as he heard shouts, then screams, then a lot of shouting and screaming from the far side of the city, the eastern gates. Something was happening. Andrew heard a tremendous roar from the mob to the east. Shouting was being relayed from tower to tower. Andrew's captain was ordering all odd-numbered men from the wall and tower defenders, except archers, to the main market square immediately. Andrew was an odd number. He ran to the southwest tower and rapidly descended the stairs with a dozen other guardsmen. Even though he was inside the tower, he heard the screaming and roaring grow louder. He knew somehow they'd gotten inside the walls on the east side, but how? He'd not heard even one single boom from that side. Then he realized he did not hear any booms from that side either. The whole of the mob, ramming teams and all, were rushing onto the open eastern gate. As Andrew reached the streets, he heard the trumpet sound. The enemy was inside the city. Every fifth man was to reinforce the White Palace walls and towers. The king and his sons would be donning their royal armor now. Andrew paused, then remembered. He was not a 5. He rushed to the city market where a couple of 100 men were forming into squares, being shouted at by an older captain of one of the nobles' guard. Andrew saw guardsmen riding horses out of a building on the far side of the square. He rushed over there and found 4 horses left. The squires marched out to meet the enemy as Andrew charging from the building into the market square and towards the eastern gate. As he cleared the market square, the towers of the eastern gate became visible. Andrew felt horror as he saw a guardsman with gold and red embroidery being thrown bodily, armor and all, from the 3rd-story window on the inside of the first eastern gate tower. Andrew knew what that meant. The barbarian horde was inside the gate tower and had ascended to the 3rd floor, out of 4 floors. It looked like they'd probably taken the 3rd floor as well, but all those floors are protected by reinforced doors on each floor that lock from the inside. They would have needed battering rams for each floor, but since the stairwells are curved sharply, they would not be able to get the space and leverage to batter them effectively. They either were left open by laziness or carelessness, or spies had infiltrated the guardsmen, killing the guards on those floors, or opened the doors at set times. Andrew just did not think this was possible. Suddenly Andrew rode into view of the eastern gate. It had not been broken, but stood wide open. There must have been spies that had infiltrated into the city. Mounted guardsmen were trying to stem the flow of the barbarians through the open gate. Foot soldiers and unhorsed guardsmen had formed effective barricades blocking the alleys along and under the city walls, but 50 barbarians at least had charged into the city streets, with several more slipping through the mounted guardsmen every second. The barbarians were rushing into the city, murdering everyone they could find. Andrew heard battle from the 4th floor of the first tower and saw arrows raining down at the barbarians in the streets from the inside windows of the 2nd tower. That one was secure, but the gate had to be closed somehow. Andrew charged, spurring his horse again and again, hurting him, driving him onward straight for the gate. He heard the squires moving up behind him, and saw the narrow streets to the left and right of the gate were being held for now by soldiers and guardsmen. The only opening the barbarians had was straight ahead, where the road was wide, towards the great market square. Suddenly Andrew watched a volley of 6 or 7 arrows flying from the first tower window into the 2nd tower windows, only to be answered by a violent volley from the 2nd tower, and arrows raining down on the barbarians inside again. Andrew charged through the line of mounted guardsmen and into the onrushing mob of barbarians, slicing deeply into one barbarian, stabbing another, and then sent several screaming backwards in panic, pushing the mob back towards the gate as he charged into them. His horse was frantic from the stabbing spurs, charging mindlessly as Andrew retrieved his battle-axe souvenir from his belt, gripped it in his shield hand, and began to swing it in earnest. The footmen in front of him stabbed and hacked at his shins and thighs, but they only met metal, whereas every swing of his axe or stab from his sword dropped a foe. Andrew was like a human tank, smashing everything in his path. His horse, however, was suffering from many wounds. For a moment, though, he stemmed the tide as his bold charge panicked barbarians in front of him, pushing them back into the onrushing barbarians behind, who in turn were slowed by remnant pockets of defenders and the archers, not to mention the piles of corpses they were having to climb over, both defender and barbarian alike. Flaming oil was being poured now from the 2nd gate onto the onrushing mob just outside the gate. It was going to be difficult for the bulk of the horde to reach this mob, at least for the next few minutes. Andrew had to reach the gate somehow. He thought if he could reach the gate and push the mob back into the flames, it might bring Marticel here sooner. He unleashed his fury. Andrew reached the gate itself, the mob having either fled backwards or simply run around him like water flowing around a rock. He felt the heat of the flames. He tried to turn his horse to block the gate. He swung and stabbed at everything when he saw a heavy spear being carried by one of the bulkier ram team barbarians. The monster was on fire, charging straight towards Andrew with the spear, but Andrew caught it with his shield and easily parried it away, then caught the barbarian in the shoulder with his axe as he passed, but he was not able to give him a lethal blow, and suddenly another spear, seemingly out of nowhere, caught him just under his shoulder armor, pierced through his left shoulder, caught his black back plate, and with the momentum and size of his attacker, lifted him from his steed, and for a moment he was suspended at the end of the spear until his attacker tripped on his horse, who had fallen. Andrew fell hard and lay on the ground staring at the huge spear that stood like a flagpole straight from his shoulder. He heard shouting and felt dozens of people stepping and falling over him. Someone fell on top of him. Then he felt as if several people were standing on his arms and legs. He heard battle and tried to rise or turn, and then he just tried to move. Finally he realized he was trapped. His vision was fading, and he was swimming, as if underwater. He felt himself losing consciousness. He thought he heard guardsmen shouting, "The gate! The gate! Close the gate!" Darkness washed over him, and he dreamt. They were on a grassy hill, with the sheep's bells tinkling just beyond. He was holding her hand, looking into her dark eyes. She was smiling at him, her hair flowing back from her shoulders in the breeze. He kept trying to speak, but no sound would come. Each time he tried to speak, for there were so many plans he had, so many ideas, she would shake her head. Why did she not want him to speak? Why did she not want him to share his ideas? He wanted to ask her that too, but she shook her head, and then looked at him quizzically. She cocked her head, and he realized that he'd never seen her do that before. Then he thought that this might not be a dream. He might really be with her. These might really be her hands. She really was looking at it. It was not a memory. He sat up, sweaty, trying to breathe heavily, but gasping in sips, staring around at his surroundings. Where was he? Where was she? He then realized he was in a guard tower. It had been a dream, and he started to weep, but he found he could not cry. His breath came out in little wheezes. He could only cry in little gasps. Then the pain hit him. He tried to cry out. He found he could only cry out in little gasps. He started to panic. He could not breathe. He could not breathe enough. He was suffocating. He was aware of someone next to him. He was sipping something. Someone was saying something, but the darkness was coming again. He was falling. He was falling away, falling. And then he was on the grassy hill again. He could hear the sheep, but he could not see them. He ran and ran. He kept running towards the sound of the sheep. He wanted to call to her, but he could not make any sounds. And then he saw her. She was walking away. She was walking over the hill. He saw her hair flying, and he tried to cry out, but he couldn't. He couldn't shout. He couldn't shout, "Stop." She was leaving him. Then she stopped, as if she heard his thought. She turned to face him, but she was so far away. He reached out to her. He tried to move towards her, to start running again, but he couldn't. She was motioning to him, as if to say, "Stay there. Wait." Then he could see her face. She was smiling. She was smiling at him, reassuring him. He could see love in those dark eyes and pity. He was thinking, why should she pity me? But she was gone now. He could no longer hear the sheep's bells. He was alone on the grassy hill. He was alone. He started to fall back into blackness, but his mind fixed on the grassy green hill, just beyond where she'd vanished. He tried to keep the darkness away, but it seeped through all his efforts. He was falling again. As he fell into the black, he thought to himself, as soon as I'm healed, I'm going back there. I don't care if they put me to death for desertion. I will see her. I will feel her hair in my hands again. He focused on this thought as he fell, and then blackness. She never appeared in his dreams again. And he awoke. He was in one of the guard towers. He looked around, but it started to hurt when he moved his neck. He thought that there were two others on tables next to him. He heard one of them sleeping. The other might be dead. He listened for sounds of battle, but heard none. He listened for any sounds, and became aware slowly of fading conversation. He thought he was on the 4th floor of one of the towers. It would be cooler there, he thought, as more air moved through the closer you were at the top. Not a bad little field hospital. The sounds would fade as the guards patrolled the wall, came closer, and marched farther away. Then he heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Why was the door open? How could they get here from below? And then he remembered, when the enemy is not approaching, only the lowest floors keep their door latched. Any sound of commotion or approach of the organized enemy necessitated the locking of all tower doors. They could only be opened by someone moving from top to bottom, as he had done when he ran to the great market square, but now the doors were unlatched? That meant the enemy had left the field. Had they won? The footsteps approached. Andrew heard a gasp. It was a nobleman, although Andrew did not know his name. He wore a robe of golden red embroidery. Andrew realized this was the nobleman whose guard he had run into in the road, or someone of his family. He apparently had been assigned a tower as another of his men appeared behind him. They were both watching him. The nobleman asked in a quiet voice, "Are you awake?" Andrew tried to speak, but he only heard himself groan. He tried to nod, but his neck hurt too much to move. He felt a reassuring hand calming him. "Relax, my boy. You're in the 2nd tower of the eastern gate." The guard put a cup to Andrew's lips, and he sipped something bitter. The nobleman continued, "My men and I watched you as you charged through the king's captain and his men and into the horde of animals. We think you killed 14 and injured many others before they brought you down. The king's captain and many of his men were all killed trying to reach you, but in the process they forced the enemy back from the gate. My men rushed out, and with the help of the infantry we secured the gate. We also found you. That was 4 days ago. They have not been able to penetrate the walls since. You've saved us all, my boy. The king has given me orders that you are to survive. Do you hear that? You're ordered by the king to live." The noble continued singing his praises, as it were, but none of this mattered to Andrew. He thought he heard a whistle, a familiar whistle in the distance. He started to fade, the darkness slowly growing around him. He heard the nobleman's voice grow softer and then fade. He heard noblemen shouting, but far away, as if from the bottom of a canyon. He heard the whistle again, but all was dark. He then heard his voice at last as he shouted, "Marcel!" and fell into darkness again. When he awoke, he heard birds singing. He found himself able to move. He was still in the same tower, on the same table. He felt incredibly stiff. Every joint ached. His left shoulder was numb. He could not move his left arm at all. His left leg was bound tightly, and he could not move the knee at all. He tried to move to sit up, but then heard himself groaning. He heard excited footsteps rushing, and then someone calling out, "My lord, he's awake!" A guard with the golden red mantle approached him and calmed him. "You're very injured, sir. Please don't try to move yet. You've been asleep for 3 more days. It's been 7 days since you fell in battle. Let me give you some soup. It's quite good, actually." Andrew took a sip, and then he thought for a bit. "Marcel," he heard himself say. "He's awake. Thank God, Sergeant. The king will not kill us." The two laughed uneasily. Andrew saw the nobleman step into view again, taking his useless left hand and massage it. "You're a hero, my boy." Then Andrew heard the sergeant's voice. He called out the name again, "My lord." Andrew said it again. "Marcel." The nobleman asked who Marcel was. Andrew tried to explain. He wanted to share who she was, what she meant to him, but all he could say was, "Wife." The two men talked back and forth, a little puzzled. They did not know he was married. "No," Andrew struggled. "Not yet." Then Andrew heard the young sergeant ask him about the road. Andrew looked up and marveled at him. He was one of the survivors of the road, who had been met when he returned. Andrew was startled. Suddenly a possibility came to his mind. This man knew where he had come from. He could send him. but he felt sleep overtaking him again. The sergeant was asking. All Andrew could do was mutter, "Yes, rode home, Marcel there, rode home, Marcel," and he was asleep again. The warm soup he'd sipped gave him a kind of inner strength. He could feel it nourishing him. He awoke many hours later and had a full bowl, and then he was able to speak for a bit. Then he had another bowl, and then he talked again to the sergeant. The sergeant described the area well. They'd been ambushed and fled into the hills. They'd been to the quarry, and the village behind it was abandoned. There were no bodies or signs of battle there, but the houses had been looted. There had been no blood that they'd seen, not even from animals, but they'd seen no sign of shepherds in their retreat, although they saw the pastures that had been recently grazed, especially from sheep and goats. Their horses were unable to feed there. They had fled far into the hills, probably being watched by Marcel, but those hills had been swarming with barbarians. They lost one man, then a horse, then another man, then another horse. Finally, they split into two groups, each making a dash for the city. One a direct route with the strongest men, the second a more indirect route, taking a day longer with weaker men. Only the weaker group arrived, he and 5 others. They had been attacked several times along the way. Almost all of them had been wounded. 3 of them had died, but he had gone through that country. He knew it, and he nodded frequently to Andrew's descriptions. When the enemy was defeated, he would promise. He promised to return and search for Marcel. Mounted cavalry from 2 neighboring kingdoms arrived from the south the next day and began to make savage forays into the edges of the barbarian horde encamped just beyond arrowshot of the city. The barbarians became scattered, some fleeing in panic, others drifting off to scavenge what they could, no doubt from the manor houses and noble estates west and north. The guardsmen of the towers and walls in the south could just see some of the mounted cavalry in the distance to the south, although they could not come close yet. 2 days later, perhaps receiving news of the incoming infantry, all the barbarians left, en masse, to the north. The infantry arrived 2 days later, just over 2 weeks after the first battle for the city had begun. The king immediately began dividing them into massed patrols, with cavalry escorting the slower infantry units. Because of the information the nobleman guarding Andrew had provided, the king sent the strongest force with special detachment of his own cavalry, along with the sergeant, to the quarry village to begin an extensive search for Marcel. The king looked forward to marrying off this young, brave man personally, who had saved the whole city, their whole civilization, not to mention the life of the king and his family. He wanted the sons of this young man to be captains, or future generations of the king's guard. He felt it was the least he could do, frankly, for this poor young man. Andrew returned to his quarters in the king's guardsman's barrack beside the tower gate at the White Palace. He stumbled unsteadily, for his left leg was still bound to the window, and started to weep. The little sprouts that had emerged had withered and dried. There would be no flowers for Andrew come this spring, and he would never know which colors they would have been. The guardsmen swarmed around him, comforting him, praising his skills, easing him out of his remaining gear and into the bed. Some rushed over a stool and poured water into a basin. They gently washed his face. Then, as he was weeping still, left him quietly, shutting the barracks door behind them. Some of them were starting to get teary also, for many innocents had been lost in this campaign. The sergeant returned several days later. He approached the bed. Andrew knew from his face the answer. The sergeant informed him with military formality that many survivors of the quarry had been located, but they had all been scattered, and they had no information about his parents. The little village was being fortified with their own labors, assisted by many volunteers from the guardsmen who had remained behind for protection. They were optimistic that at least one of his parents would be found, but this was no consolation for Andrew, who asked again and again about the family of Marcel. As yet, no trace of the shepherds who lived in those valleys could be found, no trace of a single shepherd, for several families shared those valleys. Before he left, Andrew asked him a favor. The sergeant, his military formality gone now, sat at the edge of the bed and looked with eagerness, rapidly complying. Andrew simply asked him to take the little wooden box and dispose of it for him. The sergeant looked disappointed, but took the box, looking puzzled at it, and walked slowly out of the room, shutting the door quietly behind him. Andrew did rise from bed from time to time. He soon found in a few weeks that he could move about rather well. He was able to wash himself, although he needed assistance in dressing. He had an obvious limp, and he was losing a good deal of weight. His armor was being refitted for his new size. He hardly ate. One day Andrew was surprised to find several of his fellow guardsmen approaching his bed with polished armor. They explained that the king was coming to decorate him for his courage. Andrew allowed himself to be bathed by the men, shaved and dressed in his refitted armor. It was still too big, but it would do for now. They propped his helmet on his head and adjusted it just so. But they did not drape his mantle on him, and Andrew understood. He was being decorated and relieved of his duty. He was probably being retired from the guard. For what use was he when he could not hold his shield or use his left arm at all? They led him out of the barracks and into the great courtyard. Andrew smiled a bit as he felt the cool breeze. He listened to the sound the wind made in the olive and fig trees, and he heard a bird singing from one of the towers. The sun on his skin felt good after being inside for so long. He heard trumpets and stood as proudly as he could. He saw the king approaching him, and he bowed as well as he could, although he knew he would not be able to kneel. The king smiled at him, and then, to Andrew's shock, embraced him in a strong hug. The king then kissed Andrew on the cheek, and Andrew saw for the first time, he thought, the king's whole family in a line behind the king watching him. Andrew saw the queen was holding a kerchief in her hand, and from time to time she dabbed at her eye. Andrew found himself thinking, why was she crying? They've not lost family. But then he realized that the king was talking to him, and he riveted his mind on the voice. He found himself opening his mouth in shock, but rapidly closing it again. The king was making him the captain of the guard. The king himself was holding his new white mantle, heavily embroidered in green, with golden hues around the edges. I hereby appoint you captain of my personal guard for life. Andrew heard the guardsmen around him cheering him, and then realized that guardsmen from the towers and walls were cheering also. He saw the queen behind the king dabbing her eyes again. The king came close and whispered to Andrew, I know you're injured, and perhaps you feel you'll never be of use as you once were, but know this, captain. I believe, and I am your king, that no harm will ever come to me or my family as long as you are alive. I have faith in you, Captain Andrew. Andrew felt tremendous pride, but in private he despaired at the absurdity of his situation. He'd come here only for her. She was the one who gave him the courage and energy to achieve what he did. Everything he'd done, accomplished, he'd done for her. Andrew was captain of the guard. He could assign his own duties. Andrew never regained the use of his left arm. He kept it in a sling when not in armor. As he walked with a painful limp the rest of his life. Future patrols and endless searches and a posted reward for information about her had failed to turn up any evidence of Marcel's whereabouts. She'd simply vanished. The first patrols had found an ominous sign, however, and it was clear that all the grazing land for the sheep and goats her family had used for generations was now untended. Nothing had been grazing there for some time. The herds were gone. Nobody of that name and description were ever found in the neighboring kingdoms. The barbarian horde, even, was eventually contacted, though they had retreated far. It took months of riding for messengers to find them. The king of the barbarians had been touched by the story of Andrew and Marcel. He later named 2 of his children after them, but even he had been unable to uncover any information about them. His men did secure quite a herd of livestock near the quarry, including sheep and goats, although none of them remembered having to kill any women to do so. No women had been captured or killed from those hills that they remembered. However, the barbarian king also related to the messenger an obvious fact, that many of his men had been killed. It's possible, if not likely, that the information as to Marcel's fate had died with the casualties. Andrew knew she had died. He'd watched her going in his dream. She'd given him a look of reassurance and comfort before she went. He knew he would see her again and be able to run his fingers through her hair. For the remainder of his days he remained in his sworn duty to the king. He had himself dressed in full armor and stood watch at the top of the eastern gate towers. He had even the events of the eastern gate investigated and found that many of the refugees had been barbarian soldiers in disguise. At an appointed time they rushed the gate and opened it. Only the ram-carrying party at the eastern gate, already wounded from arrows, were in a position to enter the city at that time, and they were rapidly engaged by the soldiers near the gate who were still battling the spies. But the first tower guard poured out as the barbarians rushed into the open door of the tower, rapidly catching each floor as they rushed to get down to assist their mates below. It had been almost the 40 ram bears that had rushed the first tower. It took 2 days to regain that tower, at the loss of many lives, but the horde was too far to effectively rush the gate once it had been opened. There was a long delay, and they were met by many soldiers at the gate upon their arrival. The soldiers had to fall back and barricaded the roads to the left and the right of the gate, funneling the incoming horde to the main road to the market, where the mounted guardsmen led by the captain had already formed, waiting for them. When they met the mounted guardsmen, the infantry was assembling in the great market, and Andrew had mounted his horse. Only a few dozen scattered barbarians made it through the defenses into the city proper, and many of these were killed from archers on the city walls, many more by civilians, and the rest were mopped up once the gate had been closed. Andrew's brave charge had shocked the captain, who had not thought it possible to penetrate into the horde so deeply, so quickly, and so effectively. Andrew had swung his weapons as one possessed, and a trail of bodies had lain behind him. The barbarians were terrified by his daring, and rushed back, clogging the gate, preventing more from entering, while the mass stuck just outside was continually beset by arrows and flaming oil from the walls and the second tower. Andrew appointed the sergeant of the gold and red embroidery as his aide, and retrained the guardsmen to search refugees and occasional merchants belonging for hidden weapons. Tower rules were adjusted to prevent future seizures. Guard training now included more careful watching of human behavior, ever on guard against hidden attack. Crime, even theft, disappeared in the city. But Marisol's family, her flocks, and Andrew's parents were never found. He had the armorer lock his left arm so that when it was in armor, it was perpetually holding his shield. He found he could ride when on horse. Nobody could notice his limp, but his shoulder continually bothered him, and sometimes he would wince with each step of the horse. But from a distance, it looked as if he was healthy and not disabled. Whenever he had to be on the streets, he would be on horse. The stairs were difficult, but he'd like to give himself duty on top of the eastern tower. There were several reasons for this. He wanted to do his best to fulfill his service to the king, namely that this tower would never fall to the enemy again while he lived. But also the public could not see him closely while he was up there, and his disability was disguised. Most important for Andrew was that the eastern side of the city afforded him a beautiful view that was opposite from the lands he used to know. There were no painful reminders here. He found he was useless on the western side, where he would crane his neck and endlessly search for signs of her, endlessly listening for that far-off whistle. He had been asked once if he would journey back to the area to search for signs of her himself, but he explained to the young guardsman who asked in innocence that he already journeyed there each night in his dreams. He never stopped looking for her, and even now was listening for her whistle. For anyone but his fellow guardsmen and the king, he was the hero of the city, but his fellows and the king knew what he had lost. He did not survive to fulfill his 20-year obligation. He lived just 8 years more, and then he slipped away in the night as he slept. One of the guardsmen who was billeted with him said that he heard murmuring and turned to look and saw Andrew, the captain of the king's guard, moving his right hand as if stroking someone's hair or caressing someone's head. He asked to nobody in particular, as everyone was asleep, except for this one guardsman, "Do you hear a whistle?" and then muttered in a low and tired whisper, Marcel, where have you been?" A single tear dripped down his cheek, and he let out one long sigh. He was gone. He was buried in the tombs of the great white palace alongside the king's own ancestors. Etched into his tomb was this inscription: Andrew, captain of the king's guard, hero of the city, husband of the beautiful Marcel. The date, of course, was etched under the inscription. The king's name was included, for he outlived Andrew by many years. After the funeral, the king appointed a new captain of the guard. This new captain, after the mourning period had ended for the valiant Captain Andrew, made the mistake of asking the king if the search for Marcel was to still continue. The king vented rage at the young man and swore to the captain in a loud voice that he would indeed, for the remainder of his life, continue the search for her. The search continued for 7 more years until the king passed from this earth. And the king's son, our own present king, began his reign those long years ago. He then declared that he saw no reason for the continued expense of the search. He stated that Marcel and her family be included in the annals as casualties of the war. And so they were. The tomb is still there today. Many people, even from neighboring kingdoms, have heard this romantic story. Many survivors of the quarry village came forward in those days to give many details, for it was a small village and they all knew each other very well. We are sure this is an accurate depiction of the facts.